You know, I'm stunned at the leadership that we have in Knox. It is really top drawer. That was beautifully read. Beautifully read. The choir anthem, superb. The music coming from the instrument with Suzanne's direction, excellent. The sound system, which was a problem in my day, much, much better. Why, even the clock is running. I speak to you in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Love this verse. Just as you do not know the way of the wind, or the mysteries of a woman with a child, no more can you know the work of God who is behind it all. One day a quantum physics professor was discussing a particularly complicated concept. Pre-med student rudely interrupted to ask, "Why do we have to learn this pointless, very complicated information?" "To save lives," the professor responded quickly and continued the lecture. A few minutes later, the same student spoke up again. "So how does quantum physics save lives?" he persisted. "Well," said the professor with a smile, "it keeps ignoramuses like you out of medical school." You know, when I was in California, I was privileged to attend the graduation of the medical students at the School of Medicine at the University of California, Davis. And there I heard two great speeches given to the graduates. One from a humanities professor, the other from a distinguished medical doctor with long experience in the profession of medicine. Both were about the complexities of medicine and the specific complexities of the doctor-patient relationship. Illustrating from the classics, the humanities professor said, "The thing about life is that it is very, very complicated. Even if we recognize that it's very complicated, it's always much more complicated than we perceive or estimate. It follows that life's problems, especially the ones in which there is much at stake, are not usually solved by simple, quick solutions." I wish some of our politicians had heard that speech. I want to talk to you today about navigating complexity. The biblical story of Joseph is about a very severe famine in the Middle East. Famines can be deadly. There's an urgency to act in the wisest way. Now, the Pharaoh, knowing the need for great leadership in a national emergency, recognized Joseph's outstanding abilities, placed him in charge with almost absolute power. So Joseph imposed a 1/5 tax for 7 years on all of Egypt, appointed supervisors, collected the food for 7 years, and stored the corn in Pharaoh's name, placing the food in each town in storage and holding it there. Joseph traveled everywhere, organizing the response. Then the famine came, and it affected the then-known world. Soon everyone knew that there was corn in Egypt. In reading this story, I thought all about the planning that was involved and the rollout of the grain and to those who were able to purchase it, including his own family, which came from Canaan. Joseph was a brilliant, intelligent leader who knew all about human nature. He'd been conceited, his father's favorite, both of which made his brothers furious to the point of wanting to end his life. He'd been falsely accused and imprisoned. Yet through all of these things, he learned to handle the complexities of logistics and human nature with resilience and determination. He'd been prepared by God for this monumental task of leadership. He also had a personal deep faith in God and was guided by God through dreams that came to him. As Pharaoh said of him, "Can we find any man like this, possessing the Spirit of God?" And so he said to Joseph, "Seeing that God has given you knowledge of all these things, There can be no one as wise or intelligent as you. You shall be my chancellor, and all my people shall respect your orders. I will make you governor of the whole land of Egypt. You know, I think at times all of us wish that things were simpler and easier to handle. That professional who is shooting himself in the foot, resisting all attempts to help him. Or that sister who doesn't look after herself and whose health is suffering mightily because she lacks discipline and self-control over what she eats and drinks. We discover, don't we, in all our walks of life, that again and again the only person we can control is our own self. We want to be able to help others, but fail to bring about necessary change. Human nature is complex, isn't it? And that's why governance is so hard. Some of us take on the complexity of the world and its suffering as we listen to the dark news. So many things in our world are out of control. Population growth, climate change, loss of animal species, viruses jumping from other species, from other animals into humans. Friends die, old age cripples us, we're full of pain. There are millions unemployed who need jobs. Finding housing can be almost impossible for low-income families. As the humanities professor said, life is very complicated, and it's more complicated than we perceive or estimate, and the answers to our problems are not usually solved by simple, quick solutions. So you and I need to deal with complexity. We have to navigate it successfully if we're going to survive and thrive. I had a friend in Sacramento who got on Facebook at 99. A lot of complexity for her to suddenly absorb. She did it. Come with me for a moment. I've always thought that complexity is perhaps the very best argument for the existence of God. And God, who we believe is the author of all things, could not produce complexity if God's own self was not complex enough to be able to create all the complexities of worlds within worlds and universes within universes. The Bible recognizes this complexity. St. Paul said, how rich are the depths of God, how deep his wisdom and understanding, how impossible to penetrate his motives or understand his methods. The book of Job says, God's work are great, past all reckoning, marvels beyond all counting. In other words, God is complex beyond our wisdom and knowledge. Jesus also takes up this theme. He says, consider the lilies of the field. They don't toil or spin, yet Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of these. A lily in the field looks simple. It is not. That beauty is incredibly complex. God is using this example of God's handiwork as an argument for God. Solomon cannot compete with this little flower's beauty. Why? Because despite the complexity of Solomon's court and his magnificent robes, the lily's beauty transcends. Yet that beauty, although apparently simple, is not at all simple. Billions of tiny cells make up the lily's order and beauty. Similarly, the destiny of a 275-foot redwood tree is all contained in a tiny seed. Have you ever seen a redwood seed? It's that small. That small. The biggest redwood in California is General Sherman, a giant sequoia national park. General Sherman stands 270 feet tall, has a 102-foot circumference, weighs an incredible 2.7 million pounds. It has to be complicated to locate all of that in a tiny seed like that. That is complexity. The Creator seems to be up to it. See, what Jesus is arguing is that just as God looks after the lily's complexity and the complexity of the redwood, so God will look after us and whatever is troubling us. That's why you don't need to worry, says Jesus. You may not understand, but God is good. Have you ever wondered how God could be omnipresent in a far spread out universe? Well, a clue has come. Heisenberg, in 1927, when studying the movement of particles, said it's impossible to be certain about the position of a particle at the same time as knowing its velocity. The more certain we are about the position, the less certain we are about the velocity, and vice versa. We know, too, that even observing the particle changes everything. That the base of quantum physics are uncertain, of that we are certain. The more we pursue quantum physics, the more complicated it all becomes. For instance, Niels Bohr discovered that once subatomic particles such as electrons or photons are in contact, they remain aware of and influenced by each other over any time and any distance. The actions of one will always influence the other, no matter how far apart they are separated. They're like Siamese twins that can't be divided. The two subatomic particles continue to talk to each other, and whatever happens to one is identical to or the opposite of what happens to the other. This would be true if the particles were at the opposite ends of the universe simultaneously. Now you know how God can be omnipresent. At least one tiny clue about that. You know, for me, complexity is about God. You see, if God's omnipresent, that's simultaneous. Just because it's complicated to conceive of, it can also be comforting. The complexity may very well be okay, good, necessary, and part of a final, loving plan. And part of that plan for us is our own death, which is a necessary transition to the next life. There's a great plan that we celebrate every Easter that underlies reality. You know, whether we like it or not, the planet is better because we have death as a possibility. Consider for just a moment what it would be like if we didn't die here on Earth. It would be chaos. Life would be impossible here very quickly. So it isn't that way. Instead, it's complicated. The second speech at UC Davis came from the experienced physician. In it, he described the complexities of the doctor-patient relationship. He said medicine was not all about reading charts and doing blood tests and following diagnostic formulas and prescribing drugs and recommending surgeries. He spoke of an elderly couple who were facing death. The wife was dying. One day, Jake, her husband, came to the physician with tears in his eyes, running down his cheeks actually, and said, "How am I going to get up in the morning without Margaret after 56 years of waking up at her side?" The physician sympathized, gave no answer to the question. Sometime later, the physician stopped in to the hospital room, saw the morning breakfast tray untouched, the lunch tray set beside it uneaten, and the couple laughing together. Margaret and Jake said to the physician how worried they were about him. As a physician, they said he looked so tired. Then the lecturer paused in his speech and said to the student doctors all gathered around him, in that room with Margaret and Jake, he realized it wasn't just a physician and patient relationship. It was about human beings caring about each other. This was all about connection. 2 days before her death, Margaret talked to the physician and said, "You never know what's going to happen. You better be doing what you love. Be where you want to be, surrounded by the people you love." Notice in this story two vital things. There were the complexities of dying and the beauties of connection, both handled positively by Margaret and Jake. The Bible tells us something about what to do about complexity. It says we need to handle it by faith. Rather than letting the complexity of the world and its sufferings drive us away from a belief in God, why not let the complexity drive us towards a belief in God? Why not entertain the idea that there are more possibilities than we ever dreamed? Instead of limiting God to our beliefs, why not expand our beliefs to extend to all that God is? Why don't we let go of the lesser to accept the greater? Consider for a moment, as Jesus suggested, if God so clothes the grass of the field, which today is, and tomorrow is thrown into the oven, will he so much more clothe you, O you of little faith? I believe that complexity in life can be navigated successfully when we learn to love God and love each other. Now to the verse with which we began. Just as you do not know the way of the wind or the mysteries of a woman with child, no more can you know the work of God who's behind it all. A proper understanding of complexity can lead us to experience all. The nurse approached the man, smiling. "The labor's going great," she said. "Wouldn't you like to come in?" "Oh, no," the man shook his head. The nurse returned to the woman in labor. As the birth neared, the nurse went back to the man who was now frantically pacing the hall. "She's doing so well," she assured him. "Wouldn't you like at least to come in and see her?" The man hesitated slightly, then shook his head again. No, I couldn't do that." He jingled the car keys in his palm and went back to pacing down the hall. The nurse returned to the mother. As the baby's head began to exit the birth canal, the nurse raced back into the hall, grabbed the man by the elbow, and dragged him to the bedside, saying, "You've got to see this." At that moment, the baby boy was born and placed on the tummy of his mother, whose radiant smile shone through her tears. The man began to cry openly. Turning to the nurse, he said, "You were right. This was the greatest moment of my life." By now, the nurse was also in tears. She put her arm around him and said, "No one should miss the birth of their son." The man looked surprised and said, "This isn't my son. This isn't my wife. I've never seen her before. I was just waiting to bring the car keys to my buddy who's across the hall." Just as you cannot know the mysteries of a woman with child, no more can you know the awesome work of the God who is behind it all. Awe.